Video games are unlike any other medium. Video games have the ability to put you right into your character's shoes. In some, you're in complete control of your character's backstory, their appearance, and their actions. You drive the narrative, choosing what order you complete quests, who you kill, and who you spare, and making your journey through the world one that is unique to you and you alone. One tool that developers have been using for years to help achieve this effect is letting players roleplay a story through the eyes of a character who doesn't speak. This is the Silent Protagonist. A silent protagonist is more than just a character who doesn't speak. When video games first left the arcade and made their way to consoles, classics like Mario and The Legend of Zelda were so simple that everything you needed to know could be communicated visually. Goombas are bad, mushrooms are good. Midway gates are checkpoints, flags are the finish line. Characters like Mario and Link didn't need to talk because there wasn't that much of a story to tell. They were more vessels for puzzling and platforming rather than compelling protagonists. So, let's dial the clock back even further to when pen and paper RPGs were all the rage. In Dungeons & Dragons, players usually enter the game with their own character, a backstory they've written, their own preferred appearance, often resulting in a character that's a projection of themselves. By inserting yourself into the game, your decisions are much more personal, as they directly impact the world and the characters around you. Playing the campaign like a total asshole, expect to be treated as such in turn. With this in mind, it's no surprise that when video games first started to branch out, they followed a similar template. One of the first examples of this was a game called Zork, released in 1977. Zork was essentially an automated version of D&D, which used a computer instead of a dungeon master. The game would offer a text prompt, and you would reply with what you wanted to do. Through this back and forth dialectic, you could travel to new places, uncover treasure, and fight monsters. The idea was to transport yourself into the world of Zork, and for this reason, the protagonist's name in Zork is Afghancap, which stands for ageless, faceless, gender-neutral, culturally ambiguous adventure person. The original silent protagonist in the original RPG video game was literally a pure projection of the player in the game. As technology became more sophisticated, the visual side of video games became more and more fleshed out. A spiritual successor to Zork, called Myst, was released in 1993. Myst was a point-and-click adventure game told from the first-person perspective. It begins when an unnamed character, aka you, finds a book. You read through it, and on the last page is an image. When you click on the image, you're transported to an island, and from there, you're left to your own devices.
You're plopped down in an unexpected place. You don't know the background story. You don't know where you're going. You don't even know why you're here. And go. Enjoy, figure it all out.
That was Rand Miller, one of the co-creators of Myst, describing his philosophy to game design. The storytelling in Myst is utterly open-ended. Players have free reign to do whatever they want and progress at their own pace, and that was a deliberate choice. Before production even began, the game was playtested as a tabletop RPG. Creators and brothers, Rand and Robin Miller, would describe the world to their friends like a game of D&D and track player decisions throughout. They used these sessions to help them build the world of Myst and translate it to a digital medium. One of the most important design choices was how the game starts. Whether it's Zork, or Myst, or modern games like Skyrim and Baldur's Gate, one of the most effective ways to immerse a player in a new world is to throw them into the story in medias res, literally in the middle of the action. Zork is pretty tame. You're standing outside a house, there's a mailbox, and that's all you get. In Myst, you're suddenly teleported to a mysterious island full of puzzles and weird things. In Skyrim, you're a prisoner about to be executed. In Baldur's Gate, you're on a giant air squid being experimented on. The settings are strange and exotic and immediately make you want to figure out what's going on. So for role-playing games like this, it makes sense to have a silent protagonist. But what about other games? Games with more linear storytelling that exist in different genres. What about a puzzle game, like Portal? In Portal, you play as Chell. Chell never speaks, and one of Portal's writers, Eric Wolpaw, said that was intentional, saying, quote, "I don't think people are super invested in the character of Chell. Obviously, we haven't given her much character. They're invested in the relationship that they have as the player." In other words, Portal isn't about who the main character is, it's about the player solving puzzles and thinking with portals. So, the game's story comes from without rather than from within. The sarcastic quips of GLaDOS, Pieces of found narrative like the cake is a lie and the slow but obvious degradation of the facility are all storytelling elements that don't require Chell to tell you what's going on. She's just a vessel for you to solve puzzles and progress through levels. Similar in a game like Metroid Prime, which is a first-person shooter where you're dropped onto an alien planet and there's no need for Samus to talk. But sometimes, the inclusion of a silent protagonist doesn't actually make all that much sense. Grand Theft Auto 3 and Half-Life are among the most celebrated titles in gaming history, and feature two incredibly famous silent protagonists. GTA 3's lead, Claude, is frequently in conversation with mob bosses and Yakuza, but all he ever does is listen, nod, and then walk off to complete the mission. The original Half-Life features Gordon Freeman at a lab surrounded by peers and coworkers, yet he never responds to any of them when they try to talk to him. It's kind of funny. So why doesn't it feel uncomfortable? Well, during the first 15 to 20 minutes of either game, you're given solid context for each character. Claude was left for dead by his girlfriend after a bank robbery, and now he's out for revenge. Gordon Freeman is part of an experiment gone wrong and is fighting to escape aliens and the military. From here, the gameplay is pretty simple. Roleplay as a gangster working his way up the criminal ladder, or as a PhD physicist fighting for his life. The specific story beats aren't all that important compared to shooting facehuggers and driving over old ladies in your stolen Camaro. On top of this, back in the late 90s and early 2000s, creating a silent protagonist was just easier. Rockstar themselves said in a 2011 Newswire article, quote, "We decided that the game's protagonist would not talk, partly to aid people identifying with him, but mostly because we had so many other problems to solve, and this did not seem like a major issue." Okay, technical limitations make sense for older games, but why has the trope stuck around after all these years? Let's take a look at 2011's Game of the Year, The Elder Scrolls Skyrim. You play as the Dragonborn. You explore the world, you make the decisions. But the character you play is created by you. You pick your race, your backstory, your appearance, and then you're thrust into this world. The goal of Skyrim's Silent Protagonist was to harken back to the old tabletop RPGs. The goal isn't to play as the Dragonborn, but to be the Dragonborn. As soon as a character has a voice other than the one that plays in your head when you read dialogue options, some of your agency is taken away. We can compare this to a game like Mass Effect. The two share many similarities: character customization, decision-making that affects the game down the road, a non-linear story which the player can navigate at their leisure, but unlike Skyrim, Mass Effect's protagonist, Commander Shepard, is not a blank slate. Sure, you can customize them, but Shepard is a distinct character with a distinct voice. Basically, in Mass Effect, you play as a character in an RPG, while in Skyrim, you are the character in the RPG. Many dismiss the use of a silent protagonist as lazy storytelling. And while that blanket statement may be a bit harsh, it does make sense, especially if the silent protagonist isn't supported by appropriate gameplay design. That's why it's important to know what kind of game you're making. Is it an interactive movie like Uncharted or Heavy Rain? Are you building up a world that invites player exploration like Metroid Prime or BioShock? Do gameplay elements support a silent protagonist by offering hints and letting the player figure things out for themselves? Or is it a narrative driven forward by dialogue and scripted character interaction? There are so many variables that come into play when deciding whether a character should speak or not, and it's impossible to make a game and decide, hey, if the protagonist doesn't talk, it'll feel more immersive. So, here's an example of the silent protagonist done poorly. The game is Homefront: The Revolution. The protagonist's name is Ethan Brady. He sits through being beaten, nearly tortured, and interrogated, all without even attempting to communicate or explain who he is. To top it all off, without saying a single word, he decides to team up with the very people who 5 minutes ago tried to kill him. Apart from the character's poor decisions, why is Brady's silence such a bad thing? As we've already established, the silent protagonist is meant to immerse the player, to make them feel more attuned with their character. But in Homefront, it has the opposite effect. It doesn't immerse, it pulls the player out of the moment. Because when Brady finds himself in situations where he's literally about to be stabbed with a knife, it would make so much more sense if he would just try and explain who he is. It takes the player out of the moment, wanting to shake Brady by the shoulders and ask him, why don't you just tell her who you are?
Mr. Spy, you're gonna tell me what the Norks know about us, and I'm gonna hurt you. Okay, nipples first.
And throughout the entire game, it creates this environment where it's up to every other character to move the plot forward. The game's developers even recognized this issue, and in the subsequent Aftermath DLC, they gave Brady a voice, which lets him diffuse situations and call for backup without someone magically intervening at the perfect moment. In the world of media, video games, are unique. There's a level of interactivity and immersion that you don't find in books or movies or television. To be put into a story, to make your own decisions and have agency over what happens is such a cool feeling. Today, Baldur's Gate 3 is on pretty much everyone's list for Game of the Year, and one of the reasons for this is appropriate use of the Silent Protagonist. After all, many video games were built around role-playing and being able to insert oneself directly into a fantasy world. As that tradition continues, it's great to see that sometimes less really is more. This video is made possible thanks to our wonderful patrons. Massive thank you to everyone on this list, and shout out to B, Pass, Retro, Shampoo, and Yashichi for being Platinum supporters. And an extra special shout out to Cloud and Steph for being our Diamond supporters. Wishing you all the best in 2024. If you want to talk to us, check out our Discord. If you want to support our channel and get info on unreleased videos, check out our Patreon. If you want to help us out in a different way, leaving a like, subscribing, and hitting the bell to stay up to date is also appreciated. My name is Jonah. Thanks for watching.